primary role of foreign policy is about keeping this country safe and not endlessly morally judging other people, despite the fact that clearly Israel, in my opinion, not that I'm a lawyer, but is really abusing the issue of proportionality in its prosecution of the Gaza war, and yes, is effectively flattening large parts of that society, and frankly killing and catching many innocent people up in its war. But that's not the response is not necessarily to quit intelligence sharing. The response is not necessarily to quit arms sales, which will achieve very little in the long run. It's to get Israel to be more proportionate in its response.
The Prime Minister says that the UK has a very careful arms licensing regime and has called for an investigation into the deaths of aid workers in Gaza. The SNP and the Lib Dems say arms exports to Israel must stop now, as do some Conservative MPs. But one who doesn't is Bob Seeley, a former soldier and now member of the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee. We can speak to him now. Good morning to you.
Good morning to listeners.
Many of your colleagues, well, some of your colleagues, Alan Duncan, for example, former Foreign Office Minister, Paul Bristow, Conservative MP for Peterborough, think that the time has come to stop, albeit temporarily, British-made arms being sent to Israel until we really work out what on earth has gone on here. Why do you disagree with them?
Okay, first thing, so that's two. I wouldn't call that many, and one of them is a former MP. Look, foreign policy is an issue about projecting values, but it is also about protecting the UK in an increasingly dangerous and bad world. And we have very strong relationships with some countries who some people would find morally objectionable under some circumstances, be it Israel, be it Saudi Arabia, be it, I don't know, other states like Brazil. And so what we have to do is prioritize keeping this country safe. And the reason why we have a really close relationship with Israel is, yes, because it's a democracy, but also because they have a phenomenal intelligence network in the Middle East. And if we start damaging those relationships, we keep ourselves less safe. If, for example, there are terrorist attacks aimed at this country emanating out of Syria, and we want the Israelis to help us, or indeed the Jordanians, or indeed the Saudis. And if we start tutting at everything other nations do, we're going to find ourselves lacking friends in this world pretty quickly.
Now, hang on a minute. What do you mean when you say tutting at what other nations do? Because we're talking about a specific, I mean, there's been many incidents, although Israel disputes the number of, for example, aid workers being killed in Gaza. This was a particularly horrific incident where aid workers were, for some reason, targeted and died.
Yeah, Asma, there are two issues here. Firstly, what we do about it's about specifically our judgments about what's happening in Israel. Personally, I think the Netanyahu government is a disaster for Israel. I think it's true to say that he absolutely took his eye off the ball, that they focused on undermining Palestinian statehood in the West Bank. And I think effectively Hamas flourished and thrived under those conditions. And I think there is a very strong argument to suggest that Israel, under humanitarian law, there are several. What's the word I'm looking for here? There are several needs. One of which is military necessity. One of which is humanity. And I think there's a very strong argument to suggest that Israel is not respecting proportionality in the use of force. And the only reason we are concerned about these 7 aid workers, and I send my condolences to their families, is because they're Westerners. 170 Palestinian aid workers have been killed already, and they weren't dominating the headlines. But because these are Westerners, they are. However, that is different from the dealings, the long-term dealings with the state of Israel, in part for our own security.
So what I'm trying to understand here is it then possible, correct me if I'm wrong here, for these 3 former Supreme Court judges, these 600 legal experts are saying that the government is breaking international law. The government, I think, are waiting on their own legal advice about whether that is the case. If they are breaking international law, notwithstanding that, are you still happy? That's not the right word. Would you still go along with us supplying arms to Israel?
Okay, let me answer it this way. If we stopped selling arms to Israel, Germany, France, China, Brazil would step in tomorrow. So we would absolutely gain nothing. I do think we have to be careful in this country that so much of foreign policy seems to be about a sort of posturing or virtue signaling or saying something to fill
Or
the.
having principles, some people would argue.
You could, but then there is almost no occasion where we couldn't pull out of a relationship with some country or other because of something they've done. You look at Saudi Arabia and the murder of Khashoggi. We could have suspended arms sales. We could have suspended intelligence sharing with that nation. And again, the problem is when we then, or indeed Turkey, okay, Turkey, Israel, Saudi, they all operate in areas of the world where there is a significant terrorist threat to this country. And if we start saying, well, we're not going to intelligence share with you, or we're not going to sell you arms, and then they break off their relationships with us, then when we want information to keep Britain safe, it's not going to be forthcoming. And then the same people are saying, why, oh, why don't you do something? Will be saying, why, oh, why did you do this?
Okay.
So I just think we have to put, frankly, our national interest in an increasingly dangerous world first. That doesn't mean I don't disapprove very strongly of what's happening, and we need to speak out, frankly, more about it. One of the problems is that the Labour Party can't do it because it was so riddled with anti-Semitism over the past few years, or certainly a very hostile attitude to Israel. So they can't really call out the Netanyahu government without getting in trouble with their leader.
Just finally, will national security, as you put it, will our relationship with Israel trump everything? Is there anything that Israel could do that would be aligned, that would be over the line for you?
Potentially, for sure. In the same way, is there anything that Saudi could have done, or is there anything that Turkey could do? All these people with whom we have a close relationship, an intelligence relationship, a military relationship, for sure. But I just think that foreign policy is about, the primary role of foreign policy is about keeping this country safe and not endlessly morally judging other people, despite the fact that clearly Israel, in my opinion, not that I'm a lawyer, but is really abusing the issue of proportionality in its prosecution of the Gaza war, and yes, is effectively flattening large parts of that society, and frankly killing and catching many innocent people up in its war. But that's not the response is not necessarily to quit intelligence sharing. The response is not necessarily to quit arms sales, which will achieve very little in the long run. It's to get Israel to be more proportionate in its response.
And do you think it will be? And do you think
Well,
do you think that you or Rishi Sunak or the British government can make Israel be more proportionate in their response? Do you actually have confidence in that?
Um, it's a difficult question, and I don't know the answer to that. Let me turn it around. Do we think that by suspending arms sales, we're going to make Israel more proportionate in its response? I suspect the answer is no.
Bob Seely, thank you for talking to us. Bob Seely is a Conservative MP, former soldier, now member of the Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee.
What's Labour's position? Jonathan Reynolds is their Shadow Business Secretary. Morning to Jonathan.
Good morning.
You say you've been waiting for the government to publish its legal advice, but your boss is a lawyer. You can hire lawyers. You know how the arms trade works. You're the Shadow Business Secretary. Do you have an opinion on whether arms should continue to Israel?
Well, first of all, let me say, of course, everyone's thoughts and prayers are with the families of the 3 British aid workers killed in that strike just a few days ago. Specifically on the issue of arms exports to Israel, as you said, look, there is a very strict and transparent legal regime in the United Kingdom where anything exported from the UK could be involved in a serious breach of humanitarian law. Then arms sales must stop. And that's why we've called for the government to publish its legal advice. I think that is the right way forward.
But why don't you get your own legal advice?
Because we would not be in possession of all the information the British government would have. And I think where we have a very straightforward and robust regime in the United Kingdom, we should follow that process where best we can. Of course, we've all got concerns about the horrible scenes we've seen, the position of civilians, the number of not just UK nationals who've been killed, other aid workers. Of course, these are very significant issues. But I think where we have a process and where the government is in possession of the full range of information, it is right at this stage to call for the publication of that legal advice.
Legal is one thing, moral is a different question. There's definitely enough information in the public domain. I have enough information, our listeners have enough information, you have enough information to make a moral judgment. We make moral judgments every day of our lives. In your moral judgment, is it acceptable to continue supplying arms to Israel with what you know?
Well, I believe the right thing to do is to publish that legal advice to make sure we've got the test of that. I'm always cautious, horrible as this is, to be frank, an armchair commentator on such a complex and difficult conflict as we've seen in Gaza. I believe what we all want to see is, of course, that humanitarian ceasefire, the acceleration of aid into Gaza, the release of the hostages, of course. A ceasefire has to apply to both sides as part of that.
But that's easy to say that. Forgive me, Jonathan Reynolds. That's easy to say because everyone wants peace. Everyone wants a happy world where everyone gets on. That's not reality. The question on the table is a moral one for you, and you're not an armchair commentator. You're someone who wants to be a part of a government that leads our nation. And the question is, morally speaking, with your own moral set of standards, do you think it's acceptable to sell arms to Israel that might be used in the way it has been used in the conflict in Gaza?
I believe anything that could be involved in a breach of humanitarian law cannot be sold as part of our arms export regime. I believe that the moral question we have to balance in a conflict like this is, of course, as well as what we're seeing in Gaza. Israel has a threat to the north from Hezbollah and Lebanon, so clearly there has to be a deterrent to stop the escalation of the conflict, and that is not a straightforward or necessarily easy moral judgment to make. But specific to this question of British arms exports to Israel, there should be no question where anything could be involved in a breach of humanitarian law that it must not be sold. That is our regime, morally and legally.
Should Parliament be recalled, do you think?
Well, there's no point recalling it unless the government are going to publish the information that would allow that debate to take place. I would be very cautious about the recall of Parliament in some sort of gesture that doesn't actually allow further information to be debated. I understand, there's an understandable reaction to the horrible scenes. We said that people want to see their MPs debating this, but the government would have to surely publish that kind of legal advice. So we've got the basis to make those deliberations and have that debate.
The Prime Minister says the UK has a very careful arms licensing regime and has called for an investigation into the deaths of aid workers in Gaza. But some politicians are calling for an immediate halt to arms sales. Among them are several Conservative MPs, the SNP and the Lib Dems. Tim Farron is their environment spokesperson. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Explain then your thinking on halting arms sales.
Well, I think it's important that the UK acts consistently. When all said and done, the UK exports arms to a number of its countries, including allies such as Israel. Nevertheless, if there is evidence, and there may well be, increasingly it looks like there is, that Israel is guilty of human rights abuses, then surely that therefore overrides any kind of contractual obligations that we currently have. It's important to act wisely. It's important. I do worry some people are happy to single out Israel as a place we shouldn't be sending arms to, yet seem to be quite happy for us to be sending them and selling them to fascistic theocracies in other parts of the region. But nevertheless, if you've got a country that looks like, although it's not definitive, but looks like it could be breaching international law and acting in ways which are completely inconsistent with our values and indeed with their own stated values, then that calls into question the extent to which we should be selling weapons to them that could be using for those appalling purposes.
And is this, I'm not saying it's not important, but is this more symbolic than practical? Because UK arms exports, this is according to the government, to Israel were worth £42 million last year, representing around 0.02% of Israel's military imports.
Well, indeed. And I think that the reality is that this appalling conflict, which has gone on far too long, it's important to state that the outrages that Hamas committed on the 7th of October last year, and indeed at other times as well, are utterly and totally unjustified, and that there is no solution, there's no military solution to the horrors that are going in Israel, Gaza at the moment. At the same time, we've got to say that Israel's actions towards civilians, the recklessness with which it would appear that they are executing their actions is also utterly without justification. I think, however, British politicians pontificating for their own audiences, to their own domestic audience, about these issues isn't all that impactful and is possibly a little bit self-indulgent. What the United Kingdom needs to do is to take its role as a friend of Israel and say to Israel, this is not acceptable. It's entirely possible to be like me and somebody who is a friend of the state of Israel, supports its right to defend itself and to exist, but to think that Netanyahu is a terrible man, doing things which are unacceptable, and to stand in opposition to those actions. And I'd like to see the UK government using its role as a friend of the state of Israel to say to the current government, these actions are unacceptable, and move in the only direction which is at all going to lead to anywhere that's acceptable, which is to move towards a two-state solution, seeking men and women of peace on both sides.
Okay.
Where neither Hamas nor Netanyahu play any role whatsoever.
Right. If the government's legal advice is that international law has not been broken by Israel, will you accept that?
Well, I think we need to do. I mean, if the Liberal Democrats are not for the rule of law, what are we for? So the rule of law is vitally important. There is an argument to be had, a debate to be had in this country as to whether we should be selling arms to anybody at all. That's a different debate, isn't it? But if we are, we have to be very careful that we are consistent in the way in which we both sell arms to our allies and indeed to whom we choose not to sell them.